everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to see where we're at with this effort and all the interest from so many participants, agencies, and organizations. I imagine most of you have at least seen my emails, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mackenzie Jeffress. I'm a biologist with NDOW's Wildlife Diversity Division, and I'm based out of Elko. Just a little bit of background on my involvement in the project and why we are here today. The Nevada Winter Raptor Survey started long before I was with the agency, dating back to 1990s and even earlier if you count the midwinter bald eagle surveys. But since I joined the agency in 2012, I've been tasked with coordinating the effort statewide. In that, we've tried to introduce more standardization and modernize the survey, for example, like requiring coordinates of all raptor observations and digitizing survey routes. And we also really wanted to dive into the data, some of it dating back to the 1990s, to see what all we could learn from the survey data. So last year, we received funding from NDOW's Habitat Division to conduct an in-depth analysis of the data set. And we ended up contracting that work with Boise State's Intermountain Bird Observatory. And that is how Rob got involved. He really did all of the work with the analysis and completed that in May, which is really impressive if you consider that he included the 2018 data, so data that was just collected last January. So hopefully everybody has had a chance to look at that report, and this webinar is meant to cover some of those results in more detail, as well as provide an opportunity for question and answer session and hopefully some discussion at the end. We're shooting to complete this in about an hour, and it is being recorded for those who were unable to attend, or if you want to go back and listen to certain sections. And in the meantime, just before I turn it over to Rob, I'll say I will be monitoring the group chat box. And so if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to type those into the chat box. If they're kind of easy for me to answer, I'll go ahead and answer it during the presentation. If they're ones that might prompt more discussion and be better at the end, I'll save those for the end. So with that, I will go ahead and mute myself and turn things over to Rob.
Excellent. Thank you, Mackenzie. Just a couple other notes on the Zoom software. I know some of you have connected by computer. If you don't have audio, you may also want to connect by the phone so you can ask questions later. Or you can just type your question into the chat window, as Mackenzie said, and we'll go with that. So this voice you're hearing, Robert Miller, I'm a research biologist with the Intermountain Bird Observatory, and I worked on the analysis closely with Mackenzie and my supervisor, Dr. Jay Carlisle, here at Boise State. I want to give you just a quick introduction to Intermountain Bird Observatory, just so you know who we are and why we're here. This isn't meant to be a commercial, but we are a nonprofit academic and research arm of Boise State University. So we are part of the university, but we're completely outside funded, either through grants and work we do such as this, or private contributions. We have a large outreach program focused on K through 12 and community as well. We have 9 employees, 7 full-time, a couple full part-time. We hire up to 50 seasonals per year and have over 600 active volunteers per year. We have multiple long-term research projects. Our outreach and education has relationships with over 50 schools, primarily in southern Idaho here, and we're in front of over 5,000 students per year, so pretty big. A lot of our work is in the Intermountain West here, extending into Canada and Mexico, but we also have work in Spain and Mozambique. And a core emphasis of our research is to make sure that our results do get out here, out for others to view and utilize, such as these webinars and peer-reviewed scientific publications, of which we've have a number and just had a new one today. So that was good. little introduction to myself. This is an encore career for me. I spent 21 years behind a desk at Hewlett-Packard before deciding I wanted to spend time in the locations that these pictures were taken. So now I only spend half my time behind a desk doing computer analysis type work and the other half out in the field. So I lead our GOSOC project. Many of you probably are aware or participate in Project Waffles, which is a West-wide short-eared owl program that I lead and manage. And then I also lead 5 separate woodpecker projects in the West and contribute in areas such as raptors, migration, data analysis, study design, and I'm a certified raptor banding trainer as well. So, but you came to this to hear a little more about what's going on in Nevada and your works with the Winter Raptor surveys there. A little background on the justification for that program and then how it works, and then we'll get into the actual numbers. The State Wildlife Action Plan for Nevada really dictates that the state agency spends some time looking at and monitoring raptor species within the state, particularly in winter. They're responsible, NDOW is responsible for maintaining a healthy population of birds at stable or increasing trends, maintaining statewide wintering populations, especially for those sensitive species, and I'll introduce those that are specifically mentioned in the State Wildlife Action Plan. To continue the Winter Raptor Survey work is specifically mentioned in that plan, and to develop a rigorous statistical analysis of that data, which is why we're all here today. So, of the species specifically listed as conservation priority that fall in the raptor category, both diurnal and nocturnal, these are the 8, and the ones that are bolded in orange are the ones that the Winter Raptor Survey could conceivably contribute the primary knowledge towards their status. While northern goshawks are counted on the survey, the road-based survey isn't well suited to covering their habitat, so probably not appropriate for monitoring that species, even though they are detected as are burrowing owls. So further background on the survey, if you've not participated in the survey directly, it is primarily a January road-based survey. Some surveys are done in December and some in February. Sometimes they're repeated in those months to fill out the information available. It's pretty much a statewide survey of the road network for raptors. It's augmented with this data from the National Park Service on boat-based surveys of Lake Mead and Lake Mojave. And starting in around 2013, the amount and metadata around the observations was increased so that we could do a more rigorous statistical analysis that you'll see today. It is recommended that the surveys be done by vehicle with at least 2 observers, although that's not required. They're usually state and federal biologists, but we have a lot of volunteer participants, and we ask for additional observations around each raptor, including the coordinates where the observation occurred, the distance and direction from the point of observation. So the objective that Mackenzie gave to me at the Intermountain Bird Observatory for this analysis was to focus on identifying the hotspots for the various species, particularly those species of conservation priority, the habitat associations for them, look at their distribution, status, and trends over time. You'll see a lot of that today. To evaluate detection probabilities, both to help us get more statistically rigorous trend information, but also to make some suggestions on how the program could be improved going forward, to actually make those suggestions. And we jointly agreed that we wanted to publish the result. So while many of you are out surveying for raptors this winter, we'll be working on getting that published, hopefully. So. The study area, in the red here you see the road network where these road-based surveys occur, and then you see the lakes that for the boat-based surveys that we augment from the National Park Service. So good spatial coverage across the entire state, although I would put the caveat on that we're really only sampling within around 600 meters to a kilometer from those roads. So there's still a lot of white space on this map that's not covered. That's meaningful for some species that don't hang out next to roads. It's less meaningful for species like the bootios, where we expect that their winter distribution is highly correlated with the road network. Just looking at the raw counts and top species over the length of this program, red-tailed hawk is dominant across that time period with thousands of observations, golden eagle. So a lot of those open country species are counted in very high numbers each year, which gives us the flexibility to do a quality statistical analysis on it. And as I'm going through these species, really counting down to those with 100 or more observations, I'll make a note where we believe that the trend data is highly credible or where it may be less credible. And at the end, we'll have opportunity for y'all to make your own comments about what your interpretation of the data is. I'm very interested in hearing that. So the analytical methods, the first thing I did with the data was to clean up, look at how many records or which records had missing data that would prevent them from being analyzed. And we decided to standardize on only those surveys performed in January. It's not to diminish the December or February, but we know that some of these species are still moving and migrating into your area in December, and we know that many birds moving north are staging and moving north in February. We in southern Idaho here get an influx of rough-legged hawks in February, for example, that aren't here in January. Presumably those are coming from the south. You'll see three different numerical artifacts today. The first one are only for the eagles. Those are raw counts of the number of birds detected per survey. And we do that because that data goes back into the 1990s. It was done, the road-based surveys originally focused on the eagles, while some of the reviewers or surveyors collected other species information. We don't know how comprehensive that was. So because a different route didn't have red-tailed hawks on it, we don't know if that means there were none or they weren't noted because they weren't eagles type of thing. So for the eagles, I will go back further on this kind of raw count per survey. That's not a statistical estimate, though, so I'll caution it, and I'll show you an example where we believe it and an example where we don't believe it. The real core is on our estimated density. In this, we use distance sampling, and I'll explain briefly how that distance sampling works. But it requires that we have distance information, or at least estimates of the distance to each bird that is detected to do the analysis. And for that reason, it's limited to really the 2013 through 2018 time period. But as a result, we're getting statistical estimates, we're getting statistical confidence intervals, and we can start making statements like statistically significant difference, and you'll hear that as well. And then all the maps you'll see, this is what people really tune into. They're visual, spatial, meaningful, highly intuitive. Those are based on a maximum entropy model. You know, we also use that model to come out with the top habitat predictors and the top habitat associations. And for the MaxEnt model, we did integrate the boat data from Lake Mead and Mojave into that to represent that critical habitat for a number of the species like the bald eagle and peregrine falcon. So distance sampling, that second one I talked about that leads to the density estimates, how that works is that it assumes that any bird on the road is detected with 100% certainty. So if there's a red tail on the yellow line, you're going to count it, and you will count every one that you see there. But the further you get away from the road, the less likelihood that you will detect it. This detection curve is one created from the last 6 years of data in the Nevada Winter Survey for red-tailed hawk. And we see that for red-tailed hawks 400 meters off of the road, we only have a 10% chance of detecting them. That means for every one we detect, there are 9 more red tails at that distance from the road that we did not detect. And so how this factors into abundance estimates and density estimates is that for every one we count on the road, we count as 1. But for every one we count out at 400 meters, we count that as 10 because there's only a 10% chance of detecting that. And that gets aggregated up into that statistical estimate. So it's a really cool technology. It's very well established in the literature, and it's highly credible from all the statisticians. So the map part that you're going to see, that maximum entropy modeling, why we chose that, there are a number of different approaches out that you could use for that. Maximum entropy is very widely used. It's established and credible. It's good for when you have many highly correlated variables. So a lot of different habitat questions, a lot of climate-related variables, and when you're looking across broad geographies, it's really tuned for that type of model. And when you're looking at a number of different species, if you have a very specific question about a very specific species, you'd probably use a different technology. But when you're looking at multiple species and lots of correlated variables, this is a great choice. It does, as you get into smaller sample sizes and local geographies like peregrine falcons down on the Lake District, it can become biased, and you'll see that in the results. It provides spatial maps straight out of the gate, and those are powerful both from a numerical and just visual perspective. And I'll have this caveat for a few species as well. As with all modeling, it assumes that you sampled all the relevant habitats. And one of the questions I would have on peregrine falcon is, via the boat surveys, we very thoroughly sampled the cliff-type habitat around those lakes, but not sure we sampled the similar habitat that aren't next to the lake by doing a road-based survey. So I think that's an example of where that bias can show up. So a couple last thoughts on inference, and then we'll get into the fun part, which is all the graphs and data. I just want to caution on some of these interpretations that it's not always about Nevada. These results and the changes from year to year could say as much about what's happening, about where the birds are coming from, than where they're going to. Of course, it's important to maintain good wintering habitat in Nevada for these birds to have a powerful and positive wintering ground. But the numbers that change year to year could be from what's happening in Montana and Idaho or Alberta and British Columbia. If we're covered in ice for months on end, I'm imagining many of our birds will end up down in Nevada, for example. And then the other one that we always deal with on migration counts and wintering distributions are that we often assume that they're one population, but they may represent different populations. So the rough-legged hawk, a complete migrant in large abundance in Nevada in the wintertime, may not represent one continuous population from the north. It may represent 3, 4, 5, 6 separate populations, and those populations may be going up and down annually on different cycles, and that can affect what you're measuring. So just a couple caveats. All of the genetic programs I'm aware of that have dove into this question have shown that there are multiple distinct population breeding segments influencing our migration and wintering routes. So just a point on that. So let's get into some of the numbers, and I'm going to go in taxonomic order here, starting with the bald eagle. Clearly the focus of getting this initiative started clear back in the 90s, and so it was surveyed via road-based network every 3 years until the last 6, where it's been annual. And many of those routes, about half of them, have been surveyed consistently over that entire time. So I limited the scale to those ones that were consistently surveyed. I think there were 32 of them in this number. So just using the raw count of detections per road survey, we see pretty much flat, no trending direction on bald eagle, with the exception of 2017 looked to be a very high year. Remember, this is a non-statistical projection. As we shift to the last 6 years with our statistical estimates, it does not show 2017 being a banner year. It's a strong year. The estimate's higher than any of the other years, or appears higher than any of the other years. It's statistically higher than 2015. And this is how that detection probability plays in, that sometimes just raw numbers will give you a sense that the proven statistical methods do not support. So how we read these graphs is we can say something is statistically significant if the bar height falls outside the whiskers of a different bar. So the bar is the gray part, the whiskers are the black range, essentially, that represents an 80% confidence interval. So with 80% confidence, we believe the density of bald eagles in 2015 was 0.025 per square kilometer. And the 80% confidence is that whisker range. So here we can see that the bars in 2016 and 17 are above the whiskers of 2015, so we can say that those years were significantly higher than 2015. So that's how you read and interpret this. But overall, we aren't seeing any directional trend in this graph. We're just seeing a couple, some strong years and some weaker years mixed in. As we look at the distribution map for bald eagle, a ton of detections down in the lake area as expected, but a good distribution across the rest of the state. The maximum entropy metrics tell us that this is a strong model, which means the model was very effective at distinguishing between where the birds were found and where they were not found. And that tells us we're feeding it some of the right predictor variables. If the model comes out weak, it tells us that we aren't asking the right questions of the data. We aren't giving it the right predictors that the bird is essentially using to choose where to be. The maximum entropy uses 25 variables. I'm only going to highlight like the top ones that jump out for each species. Like the bald eagle was found in lower elevations and higher temperature. That's really correlated with the lake district. But we found a negative association with sagebrush, which kind of makes sense for this species. I would say that this is probably biased by the overwhelming number of detections down on Lake Mead and Mojave. So let's shift on to a more open country species like the northern harrier. This graph looks very interesting. It looks like a 6-year population cycle, and if you read all the literature on northern harrier, that is what we would expect, a 4 to 6 year population cycle following small mammal abundance. So I'm very interested to see what the 2019 results come in as. I'm going to expect it to be a little bit below average if this truly is a 6-year prey cycle. I will bring up some caveats a little later about the 2013-14 numbers that seem to be depressed in most all of these species. So there is some concern about interpretation, but if I were to draw a 6-year population cycle, this is what the map would look like, and it's what we expect for this species. On the predicted distribution for northern harrier, we got medium fit, which means the model was good but not great at distinguishing where we should and where we should not find northern harriers, which means there's probably some more work we could do on finding good predictor variables for this species. But they were positively associated with cropland and shrubland. Negative was sagebrush. So sage, in this case, shrubland is a superset of sagebrush. So they were in non-sage oriented shrubland, probably shrublands near cropland, shrublands near marshes, etc. Negative on elevation, and they were negatively associated with development. Shifting to Cooper's hawk, we show an up and to the right type of picture with the latter 3 years significantly higher than 13, 14, and 15. When I see a graph like this, it makes me really want to step back and say, so what is going on with this species? Do we think that habitat is really improving at that level? Do we think this species across a large region is growing? Or Cooper's hawks are a tricky species. Are we getting better at sampling year to year over time? And I welcome all your feedback during the Q&A part of that of if you're on the phone and you participated in these, we won't judge you if you admit that maybe your skills have improved over time. I know mine have, but it will help us in the interpretation if we think this population is increasing or if that's a measurement bias. The distribution here, very strong model for Cooper's hawk, intermediate levels of development, so they were friendly to development as long as it wasn't too dense, and we see that here in Idaho. Higher temperature, positive with cropland. I would note the bias that we're probably sampling that development-oriented habitat of Cooper's hawk well, but may not be sampling the non-development habitat for Cooper's hawk. So there is one caveat on this species. Shifting to red-tailed hawk, possibly a 6-year type of prey cycle on this one as well. 2019 will definitely help us answer that question. And this really illustrates the value of long-term data sets. Before we integrated the 2018 data, I didn't have much to say about these. We integrated the 18 data and the picture got much clearer, and I expect that the same thing's going to happen after 2019. But 2016 was significantly higher than the older years, but we've seen a non-significant decrease between 17 and 18. Distribution here came out marginal, so this is not a good predictive model for red-tailed hawks, partially because we pretty much found them everywhere. But there may be some other variables that we need to use to help answer that question as to where they are and where they aren't. They were intermediate with development, so they were not unfriendly with development as long as it didn't get too dense, positive with cropland and those drier climate areas. Rough-legged hawk, similar cycle here. This is where I start to no longer believe it's a cycle, but it's possible. It's just maybe a lower amplitude cycle, and maybe it's influenced by a cycle that's more pronounced further north type of thing. But 2017 significantly higher than all other years. That agrees with data from Hawkwatch International in nearby Utah, where 2017 was a very good year for their rough-legged hawk numbers as well. So that increases, by looking at the data of neighboring states, that increases our confidence in this picture. Their distribution, we had a moderate model. They hung out in the areas that get very cold in the winter, had the lowest winter mean temperature, and those that had the highest annual range, which basically if you have the lowest temperature and it's still very hot in the summer, the annual range is going to be the biggest. So that one's no surprise. Positive on cropland once again, and negative on development. I'll just note here, I was going to say it later, cropland shows up on all of these. We would expect it. It's well established that cropland has higher density of small mammal populations, especially fallow and off-season cropland, than other areas. That's well established in the literature. So that's why we're seeing it show up on all these species. Ferruginous hawks, is this a cycle? I don't know. What do you think? I say probably not, but there are some whispers of it in there. Once again, 2016, the local peak, and significantly higher than 13, 14, 15, or 18. So looking back at what happened in 2016 would be interesting for this species. We had a strong predictive model here with cropland and negative with development. And You might be asking yourself at this point in time, if cropland and development shows up on 3 of these species, why does the map look differently for this species? And that's because really we're integrating 25 variables in each of these models. Cropland just happens to be the most influential, but it might be cropland and some other factor for ferruginous hawks, cropland and a different factor for Cooper's hawks. And that will produce the different maps. If we dive down into all the detail on one of these species, which is available, then you'll start to see those differences that are driving the picture on the right. Golden eagle, long-term numbers here. Once again, just raw counts because we're going way back into the 90s for these numbers. And we saw that 1995 was a high count, but things are pretty flat there. But once again, a very high number in 2018, similar to the high number in 2017 of bald eagle. In bald eagle, our statistical numbers didn't agree with that, but in golden eagle, our statistical numbers do agree with that. So we do believe that there were more golden eagles with statistical significance in Nevada in 2018 than any of the previous years. And so we reached out to Utah as well, and they had a record number of golden eagles on their northwest Utah road-based routes also. Once again, our statistics tell us it's true, and neighboring state correlations support it. Talking to Joe Barnes, Nevada Department of Wildlife, and Neil Paprocki from Hawkwatch International, both have confirmed their belief that black-tailed jackrabbit numbers are higher in that region this year and may be facilitating these counts. Distribution-wise, we kind of had a weak model, marginal model for golden eagle. High summertime temperatures, high correlation with sagebrush and shrubland. Remember, shrubland is a superset of sagebrush in this case, and a negative association with development. So we probably need to think a little more about predictor variables for the golden eagle's presence versus non-presence. Shifting over to the falcons, we see American kestrel with a pattern very similar to Cooper's hawk, kind of up and to the right, with 2017 being a non or almost significantly weaker year than 16 and 18. And so this is good news if it's true across all 6 years, in that American kestrels are a species of concern across North America because they're declining in most parts of their region. But the Intermountain West is one of the areas where they have lesser decline. So this is good news if we all trust it. Strong model and straight, what I would have chosen for American kestrel, positive with cropland, and intermediate with development. So they're friendly to development as long as it's not too dense. Peregrine falcon, we didn't have enough to do statistical population estimates, but I did run the maximum entropy model with all of the results down in the Lake District. It really chose the lake area as their sweet spot. And I would come back to that caveat of our road-based surveys are probably not adequately picking up their non-lake-based wintering habitat. And then the last one on the list is the prairie falcon. Once again, the same pattern as Cooper's hawk and American kestrel, which I would have paired these guys a little more with the bootios than with the with those other two, but it's possible that their winter-based diet aligns more with those other two species. The diet of prairie falcons has been well studied during the breeding season, but I wasn't really finding much on diet analysis in the winter time because they're kind of hard to follow around, but something that we could look into a little bit more. Looking at their distribution, the medium-based fit, positive with cropland, negative with sagebrush, which I once again, don't know why that one jumped out for this species. And I'd welcome your feedback on that. And intermediate levels of development, so they were not unfriendly to some development. So what does it all mean from an abundance and density perspective? And I will just put a caveat up front. We have to be aware of correlations versus cause and effect. But likely related to prey. I think most ecology would say we're going to find them where the food is. Golden eagles are up, correlated with our belief that black-tailed jackrabbit numbers are also up in the region. A number of the species, northern harrier first and foremost, but lesser so the bootios, followed what we would expect to be a small mammal prey cycle. Really finding out whether that's the case in 2019 will help us do that, would be beneficial. But I would note, many of you know I run the West-wide short-eared owl program, and we've been doing that for going on well, 4 years now here in Idaho, and we're seeing a cycle in short-eared owl populations that is different than what I found for northern harrier in Nevada. And it might be a latitude thing, something I'll look into a little bit more on the short-eared owl analysis. And it might just be that the prey cycles are different between our different latitudes. So different questions to answer, and some questions on the short-eared owl program that I got from doing the analysis on this program. And then that big question of why prairie falcon, American kestrel, and Cooper's hawk are all so aligned on their numbers, and somewhat more disjoint than the rest of the raptors. Seemed like an odd pairing to me. And then why was 2013 low for all species? I would expect some years to be common across many of the species, but for it to be low for pretty much all species starts to suggest that maybe there's a methodological problem with those numbers, but it may just be a perfect storm of different events converging. So we can accept your comments on that. The habitat summary, I'm not going to go through the graph. I just thought pulling it together by species and by the primary habitat types, the greens are the most influential variables, is kind of might be worth just stepping back and looking at. Development was either negative or moderate for almost everyone. So that's an important factor in conservation for this species, for all these species. And then the fact that cropland was positive for nearly everybody. The green are the most influential variables. So not only was it positive, it was most influential for more than half of our species. And it just failed to show up on golden eagle and peregrine falcon. It showed up as negative for peregrine falcon, but not a top variable there. So the sagebrush shrubland, I somewhat expected going into this would come out a little more influential, and it might be that we just haven't broken those classes down sufficiently enough to drive out that difference, and that would be a deeper analysis that could be done. So my recommendations, and then we'll move on to the discussion part of this, is recommendations is to increase standardization in the program. When you see wide confidence intervals, those come from uncertainty and variance, and most of that variance, or not most of it, a lot of that variance can be controlled via standardization. So more standardization in the program, more consistency will narrow the confidence intervals and make our results more actionable. And the question around 2013 is maybe an example of that. I don't know. So what type of standardization? I'll give you some examples. Routes would be one. On this program, there are routes that are performed in some years when they're available, or not blocked by snow, and aren't in other years. And that's a little bit of a problem in the analysis. I think it would be more actionable if routes were chosen that could be done consistently every year in nearly all weather conditions, than going on a side road that might have a really high number of a particular species, but we can't get data for it every year. So some route standardization would be beneficial. Data completeness, we did end up still in 2018 throwing out some routes that didn't have the coordinates and the distance estimates in there. So that would help. I know speed with all road-based surveys, speed is a factor, and there are a number of papers published about even how the difference between 20 miles per hour and 30 has a huge effect on probability of detection. Yet when we step back and integrate all these routes, we're kind of throwing them all together as they were done equally. And so we need to look at the safety, but also which routes can be consistently done with some speed envelope, or maybe we need to collect the speed at which a vehicle was traveling when a bird was detected would be a way to maybe mitigate that a little bit. That brings up another example of if you see a bird and you pull off and you note the coordinates, and while you're there you see another bird that you would not have seen while driving, should you note that bird or not? Most road-based surveys would say not. But I imagine that we often do because we want to log that observation. So firming up the protocol around that dimension, I think would help. We've talked about number of observers. It's usually always best to have a driver and one observer, or a driver and two observers. Some programs require that. I know NDOW's been very flexible in not requiring that, but we do know that it introduces variance in the probability of detection if you don't. And then lastly, there are state programs in Utah. You've heard me mention that a number of times. There's one in Oregon and Idaho. It's the same program being run out of Oregon, but the Idaho Bird Conservation Partnership is reevaluating how that's done. So there are a number of states interested in this question, and to the degree that we can share data and standardize and even analyze across this would become even more informative, I think. So that would be my recommendation, both to you, to NDOW, and the other states, such as my own. So, with that, Mackenzie, do you want to go through this slide? I think it would best come from you thanking them versus me.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledged all the people and agencies that have been involved with this, because this has been a huge effort. I actually meant to go through our database and just try to tally up how many observers there's been, but I imagine it's more than 1,000. And, so we've had biologists from various agencies and groups, including NDOW, BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, Heritage, DOT, Great Basin Bird Observatory. And I know I'm leaving some out, but there's just been it's been such a successful effort because of all of the people that have stepped up to help out with these surveys over the year. And it's not just paid biologists, but there's a lot of volunteers, a lot of retired folks that still go out and do these surveys. And they're not always the easiest survey to do in the middle of winter when you're trying to plow through snow and everything. So I just wanted to make sure everybody got a thank you there. Also wanted to acknowledge NDOW's Habitat Division for funding this analysis. And in particular, Bonnie Weller with NDOW created and has been managing the database for this effort. And so a shout out to her as well. And that's it.
Yeah, without Bonnie's help, we would not have integrated 2018 for sure. So,
yeah.
so that was a big part. Okay, we send out in the invitation email a series of different questions, and we thought maybe we would split up the discussion along those. So I think Mackenzie, we were going to do the general questions first, if there was anything unclear that I talked about, and then we'd go through the specific questions in the email. Mackenzie, were there some that were written into the chat that you want to start?
There was only one question that was written into the chat, and I think it actually falls to one of the later slides, so we'll save that. But yeah, if anybody has any general Q&A or questions right now, that would be a great time.
Or comments.
Yeah.
So you should be able to click unmute on your software now to speak up.
And And I know both Chris and Joe had some specific feedback for certain species that I was hoping that they would maybe speak to as well. They wrote it in comments, but I was kind of hoping they might address it too if they're willing to unmute themselves.
Actually, I show Chris on without audio, so he's probably on one of the phones and might not be able to unmute himself.
Oh, okay. Well, I can put his comment was, it was nice to know about the kestrel increase of recent, and definitely the high number of prairie falcons in central Nevada correlates with what we know. So that's cool.
Yeah.
And I wonder if Joe is in the same boat.
I'm trying. Does anybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know what's going on there, but yeah, so I was just going to kind of comment on the peregrine falcon and some of Rob's comments relative to the boat surveys versus road surveys, and I would pretty much wholeheartedly agree. Those boat surveys are, kind of hugging cliffs and definitely going to kind of hit a lot of that type of habitat, whereas the road surveys in most cases aren't. I mean, certainly in some cases you drive by cliffs, but overall you're going to be, there's a big bias of those boat surveys down south versus elsewhere in the state. And then also we do know that there's a really big year-round resident population of breeding peregrines down south on the lakes, which you're going to catch by those boat surveys. And wintertime survey work, we know that they have a pretty high site fidelity even in the winter to their nest cliff. And so there's increasing numbers of peregrines throughout the state, but if for one, we don't know if they migrate or how far they go. But if they do happen to stay closer to their actual breeding, their nesting cliffs and their, kind of the overall territory, then I think most of the road surveys aren't really going to capture that. The peregrines aren't coming down so much into ag areas like a lot of the other species. So, yeah, I was just going to kind of agree with Rob, his initial assessment, and, kind of just throw out a couple comments there.
Yeah, and I think that's, good with any survey methodology. Broad surveys are good for the broad species, but don't answer the question on the specialists as much, and those typically require more specialized survey effort, right? So.
One quick comment on frugious hawks and also potentially eagles, kind of thrown in there, but they're like, it's really, really, really early, but just getting some transmitters out on nestling frugious hawks this year, they all bolted north and eastward, all within like 5 days of one another. So it's just 7 birds, but from I think 6 different territories, 5 or 6. And so they all headed basically north into southern Idaho, also into northern Utah in the Snowville area, and then one bird bounced on into Wyoming. Of course, unfortunately, that's where she met her demise. Sorry? No,
go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to say, it'll be really interesting to see if those birds, so that's kind of a midsummer movement, and it'll be really intriguing to see if they bounce back down or where they spend the winter.
I would expect it based upon the literature. If you look at Pete Bloom's red-tailed hawk work in Orange County, most all of his birds go north up into Oregon, Washington, circle through Idaho. In fact, we've banded or trapped 4 of his birds, and some of his transmitter birds fly over our site before they head back down south into Mexico for the winter. And so possibly your ferruginous hawks will do that. Similar thing even with Ruppel's vultures in Africa and Europe. They only breed in Africa, but the young go into Europe in midsummer, and then in late in fall they go back south into Africa. So just a couple other examples that maybe you'll play out in your ferruginous hawk.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. I was thinking about Pete's red tail stuff, but I didn't know about the other species. So very good. And then just in a quick comment on eagle young. and also adults. But with all the transmitter work over the past several years, they, for the most part, stay put. They're very locally, they're fairly boring. Most of them are, anyways. They don't bounce around a whole lot. So it is interesting to see that a lot of our survey work, or the winter routes, are probably catching a lot of our local birds, as well as northern migrants and whatnot. So,
so do you have any indication that breeding success last year for golden eagles was high to support the overwintering numbers being higher?
It seemed to be good up through last year, meaning 2017, but this year was pretty bad for everywhere. Most of the places I looked down south, we had a really rough year this year.
Okay. And that illustrates the point I made earlier as well, that you're sampling multiple populations. Golden eagles are an example of that. So almost all of the golden eagles from Alaska migrate down into Idaho, and I presume into northern Nevada as well in the winter. So you have your local population in the winter being augmented by migrants from Alaska and Yukon and the like, more than likely. So I do know that most of the Denali National Park birds go through southern Utah or southern Idaho into Utah and Nevada. So great observations.
So how about any other general questions about the presentation or the analysis?
Well, I did, there was a question I think was sent privately to me about sharp-shinned hawks. In addition to Cooper's hawks, are they counted? Yes, the protocol would be to count all of them. I was going to go back to the slide where we had the raw numbers to see where they showed up. They just didn't have enough detections of sharp-shinned to, oops, there it was. 45 over the years, which wasn't a sufficient number to really play out and support an analysis.
So we did have a question, why would a bird spotted while parked not count?
Yeah, and one, I imagine that everybody has always included birds spotted while not count, or would count them if they're spotted while parked. But think about it, you're driving down the road at 40 miles an hour and you see a red-tailed hawk on a power pole that's 100 or that's right next to the road. You stop to note it, and then you see a short-eared owl on a fence post at 800 meters. That's within the detection probability. There's no way you would have seen that short-eared owl at 800 meters had you been driving. Yet we are equating those two observations as both occurring while you're driving. And like all of the observations are detecting primarily while people are in motion at some speed. And so you've changed the detection probability. When I said there's only a 10% chance of detecting a red-tailed hawk at 400 meters, that's probably while you're driving. But if you stopped and scanned a 360-degree view around you, you would start picking them up at 600 meters, at 800 meters, and now you've counted 5 birds that would have otherwise been 0. So that detection curve that I illustrated earlier with distance is based on what you were doing when you detected the bird, and that would be a different shape if we were doing a fixed point count or counting all of our birds from a single location. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I will say that all of our data today, I imagine much of it was observations made when people did pull over. They say they saw a bird while they were driving, and then they pulled over to record the information for that bird and then spotted more. We've to date have not differentiated that. Yeah. But we did go ahead and include all of that in this analysis.
And it all gets averaged together, so it's not like a terrible thing. but that's where the uncertainty comes into. So when you look at how wide the whiskers are in the estimates, the width of that is factored by things like this, of assuming the detection curve looks a certain way based on all your data put together, when really, when you're driving, it looks one way, and when you're stopped, it looks another. So.
And one thing we could consider for the future is just an easy modification is maybe for every observation made, we could note whether that bird was observed while we were driving or while we were parked, and then we might consider analyzing those two differently. That's an idea.
Yeah, or the speed at the time of detection, and then you factor that into the formula that estimates as well. So I was going 40, I was going 20, I was going 0. And so that's a way you could actually handle the different speeds as well. So something for Mackenzie and I to talk about.
Great question.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen any other general questions come up. So maybe should we move to the next slide?
Yep.
Okay. And we've already talked about some of this, so do the results reflect your experience on the landscape? Any surprises from the results? So we've heard a little bit from Chris and Joe on that. Does anybody else have feedback there?
Yeah, it's always a little bit of a challenge when I don't know your state and I look at the results. So, you know, I truly am interested in what you think on that part. And thanks, Joe and Chris.
Yeah, this is Chris, the Central Nevada prairie falcon hotspots that's always been a kind of one of the prime areas for prairie falcon. So it's nice to see the wintering data show that. But I couldn't figure out how to unmute my phone. Christy told me how to do it, so I'm back on.
Excellent. Anyone else on this question?
I know we got some Reno folks on here.
Well, we can come back to that one if we.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember the ferruginous, you got a ferruginous hawk there, but where, now I'm forgetting what the hotspot map predictor was, but since maybe that's not a good example, since it sounds like from what Joe said, they bolt pretty quickly, but maybe we can look at it, but yeah, they're all over the board, kind of. The nesting areas are more northern and eastern Nevada, less southern, but looks like they're all over the board in the winter. That kind of answers my question. So,
but you can, if you look closely at this, and this is where the spatial data I think can help. There are kind of some road routes that have a very high density of observations on them, and maybe that's the same pair year after year, or many more birds. I would need to dive into those specific observations, but like on the central western side here, there's a couple roads that have a dozen or more detections there.
And cropland was a positive factor from what. That makes sense.
Yeah. And we can dive down into what the secondary factors are. All the factors are rated with their contribution. I just picked out the most significant ones.
You know, I was going to kind of give more of a general statement because I know earlier there's been several discussions kind of within NDOW of like the hotspot concept of like that Al Hind has done of just going to like really concentrated ag areas and going up and down every stitch of land, every road, which has some value. But after seeing the product that you've managed to churn out here, to me, it's a whole lot more valuable than that approach would have given us. Especially with as the years adding years onto it. So, you know, I think this is really encouraging, I think, and there's a lot to do with it that I think we would have been hamstrung with by, you know, kind of focusing our areas and in regions where we knew that, you know, like raptors used pretty heavily. So that was kind of more just a general statement, but kind of a kudos to you, Rob, and also to Mackenzie, certainly, for keeping us on track here. And yeah, I think the process has worked us, it's done us real well here.
Yeah, and I agree. They answer different types of questions, and it depends on what your management objectives are on doing that. It is interesting right now in the short-eared owl program, the Waffles program, we are doing both. Our primary emphasis is the broad scale survey, but we do have a handful of those hotspots that we're also looking at year-to-year variation in as a secondary activity, and it'll be interesting how we use those differently. But yeah, the movement across the landscape, really requires a broad scale view, I think. So thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So we are just a hair past 3, but I think it looks like most everybody's been able to stay on so far, and we have just a couple more questions to hopefully prompt more discussion. And so the next one would be, what did the results mean to you and your organization? We have quite a few people that are NDOW on here, but also quite a few that aren't. So it'd be interesting to hear how the different organizations look at this data, and maybe even hear examples of how you might use this data. Does anybody want to speak to that?
And I typically frame this that, this is a very expensive program when you calculate and escalate up everybody's time and volunteer contributions of mileage, or even agency contributions of mileage and such. I think we would all be surprised at the price tag on this, and thus I think it's inherent on any program to understand how it's going to be used and to really know its value in that regard. So.
Well, along those lines, I think it ties in with what Chris had brought up during the presentation, which is he really thought that the hotspot data and those maps could be really useful to the land management agencies. And he asked how we might make that available, or if we were going to make it available. But of course we will. It'd be interesting to hear how we could best make that available to the land management agencies. If anybody has any input there.
Yeah, I would. I mean, that's a good question. Is how do we make it more available? And even maybe some multi-species layers where you look at multiple species and hotspots. Maybe we can't do that now, but maybe just the sensitive species or species of conservation priority, like golden eagle, Fuji's hawk, but just one thing we don't always think about when there's solar and wind development and other things is wintering use by species. We're always focused on the breeding raptors and breeding species. So that was something that came up that I was thinking would be a really good use especially for the land management agencies and the state agencies for land use planning, whatnot. So.
Yeah, no, those maps are all standard spatial data. So we can make them available for any GIS type analysis that somebody wants to do, or planning that they want to do. I think using it for energy siting, at least understanding, whether it's a risky area or a non-risky area for winter raptors would be a good starting point for a discussion with energy development, or any other type of development for that matter. And I see that someone asked about private landowners, how the data may be relevant to them. And I think that's a good good question. It'd be great to have private landowners interested in this type of data, especially on a larger scale. It's not a small scale land ownership, but like large ranches and such. Understanding which species may be expected in that area, and may facilitate either any restoration that they're doing, or I could see this playing into some NRCS type grant decisions for restoration and the like also. So those kind of hit home with some private landowners. Some of them might not want to know that some of these species are or could be using their land. You get the whole content. But Mackenzie, did you have other ideas on that?
Well, I was just thinking about the private land ownership in particular. For some of these species, they're obviously really tied to ag land, cropland. So, emphasizing that. I mean, we knew that before, but this data continues to emphasize that, particularly for some species. And so there's opportunity here to make sure that they're doing the best they can to protect these species, and that they are a good presence on the landscape if they don't like rodents in their fields and things like that. These guys are good control there. So it's kind of almost an outreach opportunity, I guess.
Yeah, I think they would see that as a positive, because they can control the jackrabbits or the rodents that compete with their livestock and things. So I think it would be beneficial for them to have them on their land.
Having worked on a winter raptor study on kestrels, I can say that how crop fields are left in the wintertime greatly affects their winter use by raptors. You'll go by field after field without seeing a raptor, and then you come across a corn stubble field, and there's 8 rough-legged hawks and a couple red tails and a dozen kestrels all right there.
Yeah, and I think our most popular or our busiest raptor route is Lovelock, and Jane runs that. And I don't know if she's able to talk, but I think she has seen similar things out in Lovelock. Different types of fields and how they're treated and stuff really affect the numbers and species that are present out there.
And that's where if we if we could be a deeper dive project here. If you wanted to explore cropland and we could get data on the types of crops and how the fields are left over winter, you could get some of more specific quantified data around that. That data is usually kind of hard to come at, but it could be a deeper focus area if that was a conservation priority for the agency.
Well, along those lines, I was thinking about all the fires that have occurred, especially in northern Nevada, and kind of that deep dive too. If I'm curious how these massive burns are impacting the raptors, and if we could somehow, like you say, either say what type of cropland, or is this in a burn, or that kind of information.
Yeah, and I don't know if am I allowed to put guests on the spot, Joe? Do you have, I do know that I'm not fully up to speed on like the burns and how the habitat has changed in northern Nevada as a result. I do know that burns are something I'm looking at from a short-eared owl perspective, because they've had both positive and negative impacts, and such a large portion of the range that's specific to this species has been transformed in recent years. So that's a question that I plan to explore from a short-eared owl perspective, but I don't know if NDOW has done any deeper look to date on that, but that could be a deeper dive analysis.
One thing, Rob, you are probably familiar with Hawkwatch's work in Utah, where they were looking at burns and skeetgrass and whatnot with golden eagles. I think they also factored in, I believe they were also looking at frugivorous hawks and red tails. I think most of the data was strongest with eagles, but after burns, they had a kind of a positive uptick in breeding success, I think, and also productivity, number of young per year. I guess with the thought being, and now it's been a while since I've read that study, but for one, there's limited cover for a lot of the mammals that they rely on for feeding. You've also got grasses bounce back real quick, and they're out there probably chewing away on some of that. But then over time, it's not good for the small mammals because now they've lost their cover, so their populations they're not being supported at quite as high of a level as they were when they had shrublands to hide, cover to bounce around between. So it seemed like longer term with the fires, it was a negative thing with eagles, but short term, you had these short term pulses. So I don't know how that would play out with our bootios and a lot of these other species, but I don't have good data at all, that out here other than just anecdotal stuff.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in the same boat for northern Nevada. It's interesting that like some of the largest fires that we've had, just even in this last year, our Winter Raptor surveys tend to not get into some of those areas just because of access and stuff, like out on the Owyhee Desert. We have some that kind of skirt around the edge that might start picking that up. And so we could definitely consider that as a variable to look at in the future. But a lot of these routes tend to not necessarily be in areas that have burned, or it's oftentimes the roads are what they're able to use to help fight the fires. And so we may not be seeing it so much and sampling that as well based just on our design.
Yeah, and if there are some particular areas you want to focus, this methodology I've used for the density estimates do allow you to create density estimates per route, essentially. So it uses the detection function created statewide, and then it applies it to a projection for a given route. So if there are some of those routes that did burn heavily and you have long-term data on it, you can start to answer those questions. But as Joe pointed out, you might need multiple years before and multiple years after to really get at.
That could be pretty interesting, though. I wonder if there's, between all of us, if we just kind of creatively think about that, are there any case studies that we could pull out and look at a single route and, like a major fire that went through? I don't know. I don't have any in mind directly, but I wonder if anybody does, have a route that they've run that, there's a major, it's been impacted, or maybe it got impacted this year, and in subsequent years, we might be able to tease out information there. Food for thought, anyways.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, there, that works. This is Heather Beeler, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So first I want to say you've got a good handful, or maybe almost half of our migratory bird program here listening in. So
Excellent.
Thank you for, most of us are in one room. We're not hugging up all your life. But thank you for this. I want to say we do use this information. I used the data that was available, a number of years ago when the Spring Valley Wind project was being considered, and that was one of our early projects we're working on, and negotiating what protections measures might be used. And the data there showed that eagle use was higher in that valley compared to the neighboring valleys, and I think it was also a bigger valley, but anyway, so we have used it. And as a lot of us are starting to work on BLM projects of different kinds, it's good for us to be aware of the data, both for eagles, and this data, I believe, is also being used, and if it's not, I'll share it with our Western Golden Eagle team for, big exercises that are happening right now that I can't go into. Something that crossed my mind is the trend for a lot of your species to occur, in proximity to agriculture. And my concern is I wonder if there's rodenticides, near that too. So if it's kind of attracting in our raptors, but then maybe having negative impacts at the same time. And right now we have some interesting changes in mitigation policy, but if that were not to last, it seems like a good option to explore for mitigation, both to prepare the fields in a way that are beneficial for wintering raptors, but also maybe to try to find a way to make sure rodenticides aren't on those fields during the winter. So just contemplation.
Yeah, the rodenticide one is a big one. California study and Massachusetts studies are two that I am well aware of on rodenticide. The state agency in California asked all the rehabbers to send their dead birds in out of their raptors, and only about 10% of them were believed to have been poisoned, but I think their rate was 85% had debilitating levels of second-generation rodenticide. And Massachusetts number was basically the same study, as high as 95%. So I can't imagine that it's not real in Nevada. I will say that we have tested one short-eared owl from northern Utah roadside mortality and one short-eared owl from Idaho roadside mortality, and both came up negative, but those were just 2-point incidences that we've been able to afford to process so far.
Okay, well that's good. I'll hope that that's, a trend and the truth.
Yeah, but the main message is, in California, they had a couple examples, a couple of golden eagles hit by a wind farm that both came back dosed with to high near-death levels with rodenticide. So is it the wind farm that killed it?
If you ask our law enforcement proximate cause. Oh, I didn't say that.
Yes, but it's more complicated, as we know. So.
Exactly.
I'd say certainly another thing that makes me really nervous around some of these ag lands is what the quote unquote the varmint shooting. When you're out shooting ground squirrels in just hundreds or thousands of them and leaving carcasses on the landscape with the associated lead microfragments and whatnot. And that always, especially now with transmitters on birds, every time they start homing in on some of these ag areas, it just makes me cringe. So yeah, the lead issue on the landscape associated with some of those irrigated fields and ag areas definitely makes me nervous there as well.
Yeah, you have acute poisoning. As we talked about it, half of our long-billed curlews in southern Idaho that got transmitters this year were shot within weeks. But then the lead ingestion issue has been pretty well studied in Oregon and is definite source of lead in the raptor chain. And I know of some current studies in Idaho going on in that realm as well, just to quantify to what extreme. We know it happens. But Todd Katzner and Garth Henning, I think his name is, out of Oregon, have published a number of papers on that.
And for Nevada, I don't know. I know a lot of it's the alfalfa versus, like California is more foodstuffs and vegetables, that kind of stuff. So I don't know to the extent that rodenticides and pesticides are used for the alfalfa. I'm sure there's some, but I don't know that it's to the same extent as California. But it may be worth looking into. But to my knowledge, the alfalfa growers don't spray a whole lot of pesticides and rodenticides, to my knowledge.
Yeah, that's a good observation, local observation.
I think to Joe's point, probably the lead stuff would be definitely worth looking at, because I'm sure there's a lot of, we know there's a lot of vermin shooting out there on the Nevada landscape.
And then it's not only just the varmint, it's also even big game and leaving gut piles and things like that. No, this is all really good discussion. It actually is just making me think we need to be working more on outreach and working with private landowners on some of these issues. And so it's definitely something to add to the to-do list.
you want to move on to the next question? I think we were covering part of it.
Yeah. So the next question was, how can the value of the results be increased for you or your organization? So is anybody have some feedback on that? Or even is there a way that we could present this data to your organization to make it more useful? Are there certain questions that aren't being answered that you would like to see answered about wintering raptors?
Okay, so this is Heather. I'm kind of drawing a blank on this, and what I'm wishing I had done is made sure that Brian Woodbridge was invited to this. Any chance he was and is listening in back there? Out there somewhere. But if not, I'll coordinate kind of, internally on the question to make sure he's aware of this report. And if you let me know where you guys put this recording, that'll help too.
Yeah, we should have the recording up by the end of next week.
And anybody, this isn't the end of the discussion. Like anybody that has ideas or thoughts or questions here on out, tomorrow, months from now, whatever, this is, there's the opportunity. You can email myself or Rob, both of us. We'd like to keep the discussion going. We are at a point where we kind of want to sit down and figure out where we want to go now with the Winter Raptor surveys, any modifications we might make, and just kind of take a step back and see what this data has told us, and then where we might go with it in the future. And so this is just a great opportunity for any of that feedback.
So something that I'll say is right now our emphasis in our agency is really on the management of populations of migratory birds protected by MBTA. So that might just be, good buzzwords to plug into the reports and how you're talking about this. And that's kind of how we'll use it for technical assistance.
Yep, that's great.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is Tracy Borneman with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I think what's really valuable is what you've done here, where you're analyzing the long-term trends. So if that can continue to happen, I don't know what funding looks like into the future, but like Heather said, with the focus being on populations, like understanding that the trends that are happening, I think is extremely valuable, and it's an amazing data set that you have to kind of continue that with. Especially like Rob was saying, as things are standardized, that's really helpful. So, I think the biggest thing for us would be just kind of continuing to look at those population level trends.
Great. And one question that kind of comes to my mind is, you heard a lot of the caveats we have to this data set. It's not perfect. The routes aren't randomly selected. There are some issues with inconsistencies of data and things like that. And, Rob's done a really good job of cleaning it up, but, it's still, it's not ideal if you were to start from scratch, and, you might consider doing it a little differently if you were to be on year one, but this is a long-term data set, so we didn't want to drop everything and scrap it. So I guess my question is that given those caveats, do you feel comfortable with the data and the way it looks, like the long-term trend data, and does everybody like this approach still?
Okay. Our first reaction is yes. So first of all, it's the best available data, and while there's some standardization to it, sure it could be perfect, but nothing is perfect. That's my first reaction.
Okay.
From this room, and we don't represent everybody listening in.
And you've probably already heard what I have had to say before as well, but I mean, I think it is so valuable. Like the, you know, I mean, we're kind of talking about long term, but in reality, things really got, you know, kind of battened down and refined in like 2013. So it's more kind of this later time period. So we're really in that zone where like each year is so valuable, and we're, you know, now we're dialed in. And yeah, I know there are still inconsistencies, but we're doing a lot better. And, you know, like Rob was pointing out, some of these cycles where, you know, if you kind of cut it off now, you really, you know, you're doing a disservice to all those years that you know, that preceded this. So it does really seem, you know, now that you know, you get this product to look at and you realize how valuable each successive year is. Yeah, I don't know. It would be a shame to, you know, see gaps in years or whatnot, you know, see the effort, you know, kind of get a misstep or something. Because, you know, there's always discussion about what we're going to do next.
No, that's great to hear. And just talking with Rob yesterday, he's like, I can't wait to see the 2019 data. Like, you know, he's really excited just for next year's data. And I agree, it's a great long-term data set that we are lucky. Not many of the states have this to work with. And it has been used so far in some of the larger scale efforts. I do know Fish and Wildlife Service used it a few years back for some of their modeling efforts. So on the bigger scale. So we actually are kind of being looked to as an example of maybe where to go to do winter raptor stuff. And there's even interest from other states in maybe modeling after what we're doing. So it's really great. Okay. So we have one last, I think one last comment. Getting this information out to the conservation districts would be really beneficial. And so we can work on ways to do that as well. I'm trying to see if I missed any others in the chat. Yeah, there's an event in Carson Valley that we could share some of this information for sure. Yeah, so it's a big thing is just getting this information out there. And if anybody has ideas, and again, the report's available, this presentation will be available, please help us distribute this information. Like Rob said, we'll be putting together a publication here soon, so hopefully that will hit some different folks as well. But we're more than happy to share what we produced so far, and to even look at producing other things that might be useful with this.
Yeah, Mackenzie, this is Derek. Just another thought was the Society for Range Management. I know they have newsletters that go out 3 or 4 times a year. They have meetings, you know, with the Nevada chapter, and that might be a good venue to get some of the livestock folks and range management folks involved in seeing this as well. Just another thought.
Yeah, that's great.
And this is Chris, just reflecting the comments online is, yeah, that it would be good to start bringing this information out to the conservation districts, those private landowners we talked about, and just really pushing the education side that, you know, they can benefit raptors, and raptors use those in lieu of rodenticides, you know, they'll natural control, those kinds of things. That's probably got a lot of opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, Rob, how do you feel about wrapping up?
I think this was fantastic. I like the discussion and engagement a great deal. So thank you everyone for that. And I want to thank Mackenzie for kicking off managing this whole project, you know, allowing me to participate and leading this webinar. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Rob. And yeah, thank you everybody for participating. And like we said, so I'll use my same email list to share the YouTube video once it's available sometime next week. And then in that, we'll make sure everybody knows the contact information for both Rob and myself. And then when the publication does become available, we'll make sure to use that email list to share that as well. Yeah, well, it's been a great webinar. Thanks, Rob, for setting it all up.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
And Rob, I will save the chat right now.
Yes, you should do that.
Okay.
I accidentally ended the meeting of a previous webinar before doing that. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I think that worked really well.
So I'm going to wait for everyone to hang up before I do it.
Okay.
Now we can see who all fell asleep on there.
Yeah, I know. They're just keeping it up and running in the background.
Jane.
Yep.
Okay, I've got the chat saved as well. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording.